Imagine a life defined by silence, a princess stripped of her royal title, whose greatest act of courage led only to abandonment, political manipulation, and a final permanent consequence. Her name was Michal, the first wife of King David. She risked everything for love, defying her father, King Saul, yet, when her husband became the most powerful man in Israel, she was reduced to a bargaining chip, a footnote in his grand political rise. But the real tragedy came much later, not with a sword or a political maneuver, but with her own mouth. The Holy Scriptures record that after a single venomous confrontation with David, Michal was never able to bear a child for the rest of her life. This consequence of barrenness is more than a biological fact. It's a profound spiritual lesson. What happened to transform a woman who once loved fiercely into someone filled with such bitter contempt? Why did she choose to lash out at David's sincere act of worship? And what does this devastating ending teach us about the unforgiving cost of letting our personal wounds overshadow sacred moments? Today, we will unpack the complex, heart-wrenching story of Michal and understand how the hurt we carry can become a wall between us and God's presence. The beginning of Michal's story is a true biblical romance. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, following David's legendary defeat of Goliath, we are given a rare and powerful declaration. Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. This wasn't a political arrangement initially. It was genuine, heartfelt affection for a young shepherd-turned-warrior who had captured the public imagination. King Saul, however, saw the match not as a blessing, but as a strategic weakness to exploit. Consumed by jealousy because the Lord was with David but had turned away from Saul, the king devised a deadly plot. He demanded an outrageous dowry. 100 Philistine foreskins, fully expecting David to be killed, attempting this suicidal mission in enemy territory. The dowry was meant to be a death trap, a political assassination masked as a marriage requirement. But David, fueled perhaps by the knowledge that the king's daughter genuinely loved him, completed the mission and doubled the request. Michal became his wife, but the marriage immediately became collateral in the escalating conflict between father and son-in-law. This tension culminated when Saul ordered David's house to be watched, planning to kill him at dawn. Michal chose her husband over her royal lineage, and in a daring act let David down through a window, covering the deception with an idol figure on their bed. She chose love. She chose life. Michal's heroic midnight escape for David, a moment of profound commitment, was immediately followed by a chilling, gut-wrenching silence that would haunt her for years. Think about that night she chose him over the death sentence her father would impose on them both. She risked the gallows to save his life. Yet as David the fugitive ran for his survival, he never looked back. He never came back for her. There was no recorded attempt to extract the king's daughter, who had just risked everything. This is the origin of the first deep wound that poisoned Michal's soul, the raw, undeniable reality of abandonment. As David found refuge in the desolate caves and began his rise to power, amassing followers, he also sought human comfort and took new wives, Abigail and Ahinoam. For Michal, there was no freedom. She was left alone in the vengeful kingdom, a constant target of her father's political rage. Saul, determined to completely sever David's claim to the royal family, delivered the final humiliating blow by forcibly giving her to a man named Palti, son of Laish, 1 Samuel 25:44. This was more than a remarriage. It was a public declaration that her bond with David was erased, an act of political vengeance enacted upon her body and future. She transitioned from being a devoted wife to a political casualty, a former princess, a forgotten memory forced into domesticity with a man she didn't choose. For years, she lived under the crushing weight of that irony. The man she risked death for was alive, free, and completely uninterested in fighting for her return while she was trapped in a loveless arrangement. This prolonged period of being disregarded, silenced and utilized as a pawn, cemented the deep, poisonous contempt that would later turn her heart to stone. She was a woman who gave her whole heart and received a strategic rejection in return, learning a painful lesson that power often chooses expediency over loyalty. The silence surrounding Michal's life was shattered, not by a loving plea, but by the cold, calculating voice of political necessity. Years after her midnight heroism and his subsequent callous abandonment, David was no longer the fugitive shepherd. He was the king in waiting, ruthlessly focused on unifying a fragmented Israel. To fully consolidate his rule, particularly over the northern tribes, who still held fiercely to the legacy of Saul's house, David needed a clear, undeniable tie to the former dynasty. Michal was that crucial living link. In a move utterly devoid of personal warmth recorded in 2 Samuel 3, David didn't send a tender request for a wife's return. He issued a formal, ice-cold demand. His decree was shockingly transactional, referencing the original price he paid years ago. "Give me back my wife Michal, whom I married for 100 Philistine foreskins." The language makes it excruciatingly clear she was a debt owed, an object of strategic value, not a cherished partner whose absence caused him pain. David's agents retrieved her from Palti, the man she had been forcibly married to. And this is the profound, heartbreaking irony that highlights Michal's tragic fate. Palti, the man who was meant to be her placeholder, truly loved her. The scripture paints a vivid, sorrowful scene where Palti followed them, weeping openly and uncontrollably, until David's men callously ordered him to turn back. Michal was literally dragged from a home where, however imperfectly she was, the focus of genuine human love, and delivered back to a magnificent palace where she was merely a royal trophy, one wife among many. No recorded reunion, no whispered words of sorrow or reconciliation from David, only a chilling delivery to her new or old gilded cage. This return did not heal her deep wounds of abandonment. It only exacerbated them, confirming her deepest, most cynical fear that her worth to David was purely political, a pawn in the king's game, and that her heart had been strategically dismissed years ago. This calculated delivery fully cemented the deep root of bitterness that would soon burst forth in her tragic final act. The stage was set for Michal's final tragic act, not on a battlefield, but during a national day of spiritual euphoria. King David was finally bringing the Ark of the Covenant, the beating heart of Israel's faith, and the very throne of God's presence, into Jerusalem. The city pulsed with unbridled joy and devotion. For David, this was the moment of complete surrender. 2 Samuel 6 paints a vibrant contrast. David, the mighty king, willingly stripped away his royal majesty, donning only a simple linen ephod, a gesture of profound humility, and danced. He wasn't performing a stately minuet. He was leaping and dancing before the Lord with all his might. This was an act of pure, unfiltered passion, directed entirely at the God who had elevated him. But then the narrative shifts, focusing on a single, isolated figure. High above the celebratory chaos, in the cold, shadowed silence of the palace window, stood Michal. As she watched her husband, the king, leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. v. 16. Why such contempt? Michal didn't see a worshiper. She saw the man who abandoned her, the political operator who reclaimed her as chattel, and now a king humiliating himself. Her deep-seated wounds, the years of political isolation, the shame of being married to Palti, and the bitterness of living in a loveless royal harem, had festered into a cynical poison. She couldn't recognize David's devotion because she could only see his human failings toward her. When David returned home, radiant with spiritual joy, Michal lay in wait. The verbal assault she unleashed was merciless, a final fatal eruption of stored-up pain. How the King of Israel has distinguished himself today, uncovering himself today, in the eyes of his servants' female servants, as a vain man shamelessly uncovers himself. She didn't just criticize his lack of decorum. She assassinated his character, questioning his worthiness as king and suggesting his worship was nothing more than lewd exhibitionism for the servant girls. This confrontation was more than a marital spat. It was Michal using her profound personal hurt to lash out at and attempt to extinguish a sacred moment of genuine worship. Michal's verbal assault was immediately met not with an apology, but with King David's decisive spiritual counterattack. David didn't engage in a petty marital squabble. He elevated the conflict to a theological declaration. His words were a direct refutation of the pride that had destroyed Michal's family. "It was before the Lord who chose me before your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the Lord's people over Israel. Therefore, I will dance before the Lord." 2 Samuel 6:21-22. This was David drawing the ultimate line in the sand. His worthiness derived solely from God, not from human decorum or royal protocol. He essentially told her that he was ready to become even more contemptible and humble himself further, if that's what true worship required. This was the final irreversible severance. Michal allowed her deeply personal valid wounds, the abandonment, the political use, the heartache to poison her perception, weaponizing her judgment against an act of pure devotion. And then comes the devastating final blow, delivered by the silent, stark reality of the scripture itself. The last sentence we ever read about Michal seals her fate. "And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child until the day of her death." 2 Samuel chapter 6:23. This is more than a biological detail. It is the ultimate consequence in a culture where lineage meant everything. Her life ended in barrenness and silence. She failed to secure a legacy, a continuation, a voice for the future. The message is undeniably haunting and serves as the profound lesson for all of us. When our unresolved personal hurt becomes so corrosive that we cannot recognize respect or participate in the sacred presence of God, we risk cutting ourselves off from the very source of life blessing and future hope. Michal chose to hold on to her wounded pride and resentment, and in doing so, she forfeited the opportunity for future restoration and divine favor, leaving her story to end, not with a bang, but with a sterile, sorrowful silence. The story of Michal is not simply a historical footnote about a king's wife. It is a timeless, crucial mirror, reflecting the deepest human struggles. She teaches us that our genuine love and courage at the start saving David do not grant us immunity from life's subsequent betrayals. His abandonment, the political use. Michal was not a villain. She was a victim who allowed her valid pain to turn into something toxic. Her tragedy crystallized when she faced the Ark of the Covenant. She had a choice to either release her deep-seated resentment and acknowledge the presence of God that had elevated David, or to let her wounded pride speak. She chose the latter, lashing out at devotion itself. The consequence, her barrenness, serves as a solemn warning. Our unresolved hurt has the power to cut off our future. It prevents us from receiving the blessings intended for us and from fostering a legacy of life and hope. David, despite his own imperfections in the relationship, chose radical humility before God, and his lineage continued. Michal chose to preserve her wounded pride, and her story ended in silence. We must confront the uncomfortable truth. Are we today letting our past hurts, the abandonment, the betrayals, the injustices prevent us from truly worshiping? Do we allow our bitterness to judge and dismiss the genuine devotion of others? Don't let your story end in spiritual barrenness. Choose worship over resentment, humility over pride, and God's presence over the prison of your pain.